Hello and welcome to our webinar series, Art and Architecture with Curt DiCamillo. My name is Ginevra Morse. I manage the events and programs here at American Ancestors and New England Historic Genealogical Society. I will be your moderator and virtual MC for today's event. American Ancestors is a nonprofit organization supported by our members and donors. We are the oldest and largest genealogical organization in the country. We specialize in providing resources, research, and expertise that uncover the stories of families, family objects, and family homes. We are pleased to offer such programming for our members and friends around the world. In today's session, which is part travelogue, part virtual tour, Curt DiCamillo will revisit our 2018 American Ancestors Heritage Tour to Yorkshire, bringing you to some of the best country homes in the region. If you have any questions, please feel free to type them into the question panel at any point during the presentation. We'll answer as many as we can at the end. I also want to note that we are broadcasting from our homes to yours with various limitations and distractions. We do apologize in advance if there are any interruptions from our end, and we thank you for your patience. And if we were to lose the connection for any reason, don't worry, you will still have access to a full recording of this presentation on our website. So our presenter is Curt DiCamillo, an internationally recognized authority on English country houses and the decorative arts. Curt joined American Ancestors in February of 2016 as our first curator of special collections. In that role, Curt provides strategic direction and expert guidance for organizing and exhibiting our extensive collection of family history-related artifacts. He has also led highly successful heritage tours for our organization to England, Scotland, and Italy, and he's lectured extensively in the United States and abroad. Curt was previously Executive Director of the National Trust for Scotland Foundation, USA. So without further ado, please welcome Curt DiCamillo.
Good afternoon, everybody. This is the first time I've given a lecture to you guys since daylight savings, and it's very depressing. Looking out my window and seeing that it's almost dark, but the good news is that it's 63 degrees here in Boston today. Yesterday morning, it was 23 degrees. In New England, that 40-degree thing seems to happen a lot, and I suspect it happens a lot in Yorkshire too. So you're looking at a map right now of Britain, and Ginevra very kindly put this together for us to show us the context of how far Yorkshire is from London and how close it is to Scotland, which is to say how far north it is. I think for my money, Yorkshire and Derbyshire are the two counties that have the best country houses in England. And in June of 2018, we actually explored, I think, the best of those houses in Yorkshire from York itself. And we stayed, as we always try to do on my tours, at an actual country house. If not a country house itself, a country house that's been converted into a hotel. And that was the case at Wentworth Hall, which you see here, that was built in the waning years of the 17th century and is just sort of a perfect piece of early 18th century architecture. Red brick, peaceful, calm, and for Americans, I'm telling you that I took this photograph around 9:30 at night, which in America, it's never this light at 9:30. It's just such a wonderful thing. We were treated so fantastically there. And I want to show you the drawing room because this is what a country house should look like on the inside. We had the best service. It was fantastic. And for those of you who weren't there with us, welcome. And for those of you who were there with me in 2018, hopefully this will be a little tour down memory lane. We won't have time to see all the places that we visited on the tour, so I've concentrated on the coolest 11 houses. And some of these houses have appeared in my earlier lectures. So for those of you who tuned into those, I've tried to pick different photographs so you're not bored with seeing the same pictures again. And they are all in alphabetical order. So let's start with the B's. Let's go to Bramham Park, which is an early 18th century house you see here. Amazingly enough, it stayed in the original family since it was built, completed in 1710. There's a lot of different influences going on in this house. You see Florentine sort of Palladian architecture. You see influences of Versailles. We don't know who the architect was. very likely the owner himself designed it. And it also has influences, I think, of Chatsworth. One of the architects who worked on Chatsworth, Talman, is also rumored to have worked on this place. To me, the coolest thing about this house is that it's still a family home. And just so you know how important horses were, look at the stables here. Stables house the most important thing in a country house. I think in most owners' minds, the horses are more important than their own children. And invariably in every house you see stables that are the equivalent of the house, and sometimes the stables are actually grander than the house. But speaking of grandness, you were meant to understand when you were coming to this house what you were coming into, which is a grand house. That drive that you see, which leads off in the distance, is a drive that you come down to the house. I'm standing on the front steps taking this photograph. It's almost a mile long, and it's meant to tell you that you are in fact arriving at a very important house. It's building up the theater of the arrival. And when you come into the Great Hall, the entrance hall, it's this astounding Baroque masterpiece. And when I show this photograph to people, I oftentimes hear them say, why are the walls so dark and scary looking? And that's because there was a great fire here in 1828, and the house was abandoned for 80 years after that. The roof was off, it was left to the elements. So you see on these walls, the stone walls in this hall, burn marks from the fire and also water damage over the years. It wasn't restored until the early 20th century when the family moved back in. And I said to you, one of the great things about these houses is the sense that they're family houses. And in this case, Rachel and Nick Lane Fox, who own the house today, very kindly hosted us for a dinner in their dining room. And this is the thing that I hear more and more from people who come on our tours, is this is what they like. They like the idea of being in a house with nobody else, not the horrible, great unwashed people paying their National Trust entry fees. And sitting down with the owners and understanding what a country house was, how it worked, how it was meant to be, and that they still exist today. That's the most amazing thing. And survey after survey shows in these houses that are open to the public, people prefer a house that is still lived in by the original family rather than one that's opened as a museum. If you go out back of Bramham, you'll see this wonderful afternoon sun. This is probably about 7 o'clock at night. Just fantastic. But if you go to the left, you walk out those stairs and go to the left, you see these great vistas, and this is very much indicative of what you would see, particularly in the 18th century. This is all very contrived, of course, to direct your eye toward the temple and to the obelisk behind that. If you turn to the right instead of the left, you would see the chapel, which was built in an 18th century Greco-Roman temple format. Still a consecrated chapel today. And the best thing of all on the tours we do is alcohol. Well, there's also food too, which is nice. And this is a tour I did in 2012 to Yorkshire, and two of our participants who were having a really nice time on that balcony you saw on the garden facade. And to me, this is a perfect example of what it means to be in England, the promised land, away from the rest of the world. For Americans, it just, as I was putting this lecture together over the last few weeks, I kept on thinking, why in the hell don't I live there? So let's move on to another B, and to the Victorian era. And that's Brodsworth Hall, which was built in the mid to late 19th century. Now, this is an interesting house because it undergirds a story. And that story, for those of you familiar with Dickens, is Bleak House. Bleak House was based on the family that built this house. And in this case, it was a man named Peter Thulesen, who was an enormously wealthy man in the late 18th century, and for reasons that I am unaware of, decided that he didn't like his children or his grandchildren. So he wrote a will that disinherited the next two generations and left everything to his great-grandchildren. Not surprisingly, the family was very upset about this, and they sued. This went on for over 60 years in the courts. It's still actually a major court case you learned about today in the English law. And that was the whole idea. If you remember Jarndyce versus Jarndyce in Bleak House, that's what this was based on. By the time the money came to one of the heirs, enormous amounts of it had been wasted on lawyers' fees, and that's the whole point of this, of course. but there's still a lot left. And the guy who inherited built this house with that. And it's interesting because over the years, as oftentimes happens with these wealthy families, the money petered out. And by the 1930s, the house was in very bad shape. The two people who lived there, man and wife, just gave up as room after room became infested with dry mold and rot and leaks. They just closed those wings of the house and didn't go in them anymore. This is all exacerbated by the fact that there was tunneling going on from coal mining, so the land was sinking around it. By the time it came in 1990 to English Heritage, the government body that took it on, it was given to them by the last couple's daughter. There was very serious problems with the structure of the house. English Heritage took the interesting idea that they would preserve this house in its faded Victorian glory, because it is a perfect Victorian house and the interiors were never touched. But before we go inside, we're going to go outside because these gardens are spectacular. This tour that we did in 2018 to Yorkshire was during a drought, and I have never seen such intense sun in England. We had sun every day, and those of you familiar with photography know that bright sun actually isn't that great. So I feel like it's horrible to complain about sun, but it was hard to get good shots, and this is almost overexposed here. This wonderful shot of very Victorian gardens. Parterre is laid out with a folly over in the distance, and this garden has won the English Heritage Garden of the Year, I think twice. You follow where we see here down into these glens, these little dells that they built that created microclimates that allowed warmer shrubs. You look in the bottom right there, you can see a variety of palm that exist in this microclimate. These gardens go on and on and on. We had the most amazing tour with the head gardener. I don't think anybody actually wanted to leave. We did leave actually near the Rose Pergola, and this is actually one of our most wonderful travelers thinking how he could take this pergola back with him to America. After this, we went to the back of the house of the garden facade, and as there should always be, there was champagne waiting for us. And then after that, we went inside and had a tour of this house, which you see in the entrance hall is everything that you would expect for a Victorian house, which is to say dark, lots of color, but very dark. If we go to the drawing room, which is the most spectacular of all the rooms, you see this sort of cross between typical Victorian and, in this case, I think almost like a London club. What makes this room particularly special, I think, are the ceilings. And in this next slide, you can see these stenciled ceilings that are as they were. They have not been restored. It's amazing that they survived as well as they did. We ended going upstairs to have dinner. The CEO of English Heritage very kindly came up from London to spend dinner with us, and she told us we were the very first group ever allowed to have a meal inside Brodsworth since English Heritage took it over in 1990. So let's talk about possibly the most famous house in England, and that's this house. And if I have to tell you what this house is, you just have to go home and you don't get dinner tonight, because of course this house is Castle Howard, which is not only, I think, one of the most famous houses in England, but one of the most important. It's generally considered the first great house of the 18th century. It was built at a time that domes were not put on private houses. It was the first private house in England to have a dome on it. And when it was finished, it was rather grander than anything that the Queen, at this point, the Queen of England had at the time. And what's even more amazing, it was in the middle of nowhere in Yorkshire. It's been made famous, of course, by that amazing film production, 1981's Brideshead Revisited, and then again in 2008 for the theatrical version. They estimate that 20 million people have come to visit this house because of the TV series. It's sort of hard to take it all in. I mean, it's so grand, it's so over the top. The Great Dome is 80 feet tall. I mean, it just goes on and on. So let's go inside, and we'll lead into the Great Hall through the antique passage, which you see here, which is filled, as you might guess from its name, with primarily antique sculptures, which is, say, Greek and Roman, I think mostly Roman. And this next one actually is a perfect example, not only of pieces of sculptures, but also the story of how English country houses survive today. So you see here this boy with goat, which is believed to be 2nd century Roman. This was probably brought back by the 5th Earl of Carlisle in 1768, and the Carlisles built this house. It is still here, and this is the interesting part, but it no longer belongs to Castle Howard. And that's because of taxes. About $8 million in inheritance taxes came due around 2015. And in order to satisfy that, 89 pieces of Roman sculpture were given to the government in lieu of tax. Now, the government very wisely has decided that the best thing to do with these things, which they normally would have given to a museum, is to still give them to the museum, but then insist that the museum loan them back so they remain in the place for which they were designed, so they don't take the set piece away. And I say it's important because Americans, I think, oftentimes believe that having one of these great houses is like the dream of a lifetime. Well, it's the financial drain of a lifetime to have a house like this. And when you see the death duties and you see all the buildings in the state you have to maintain and the roof, in some cases, not at Castle Howard, but in some of these houses, it will cost $10 or $15 million to put on a new roof. But let's go into the Great Hall, because this is unlike any other room in England, and it's very Roman, very Baroque. And of course, Castle Howard is a Baroque house. It was designed by Charles Vanbrugh, who was one of the most important architects of the 18th century. And interestingly enough, he didn't start off as an architect. He was a playwright and a spy. And the 3rd Earl of Carlisle, who commissioned this house, was unhappy with his architect. And basically, his friend, his clubmate, Vanbrugh, the equivalent of sketching out on a napkin, said, "Here, I can do a better job for you." And he did. Look at this. This takes your breath away for a private house. And it just gets bigger. You look at this next photograph, we're looking up to the dome. Unfortunately, because it was such a sunny day, I couldn't get a picture of the dome without totally overexposing this photograph. But you get a sense of the proportion of this house. You probably really don't get a sense of it. So let's look at a 1850 illustration from the Illustrated London News that commemorated an 1850 visit to Castle Howard by Queen Victoria. So you can see the scale looking up into the dome where it says, "God save the Queen." This is something, of course, that everybody wanted if they had a major house, was to have a royal visit. And it was obviously important enough that the newspaper sent an engraver up to draw this and then have it later engraved. And to give you a sense of proportion, Christopher Ridgway, who is a curator here, very kindly allowed me at a later trip to go up into the dome. Now, I'm not fond of heights, and this picture I took, I didn't even feel comfortable taking my camera. I took this with my phone. It gives you a sense of the height of this place, and what's sad about this is that in 1940, during the war, it was occupied by a girls' school, and the house caught fire, and the Great Dome collapsed, and large parts of the house were gutted. Little by little, most everything has been put back. There are wings of the house that are still ruinous, but the dome was rebuilt, and you see this astonishing collection of art, most of which was not harmed by the fire. And most of the best pieces of that are in the Long Gallery, which you see here. And long galleries generally were built in country houses to provide exercise when the weather was bad, but also to hang your best pictures, to show off to your friends. And what I think is amazing about this is if you look at this photograph of this gallery today, and then you look at this painting done in 1810, or around 1810, of the very same gallery with the 5th Earl of Carlisle and his son, you can see how little it's actually changed. And that's something that I think is very indicative of the best houses in England, which is that they maintain a continuity. And should you think that all the rooms are very big and cold and drafty, let me show you the turquoise drawing room, which is everything you would expect an 18th century proper English country house to be. But I think even nicer than that is the red drawing room, which I think is actually properly called the crimson drawing room. But we're calling it red because we're American and we don't know what crimson means, unless it means Harvard, which of course in Boston, it always does. So take all this in. This to me is a perfect bringing together of merging of all the pieces of a great country house. So you have Italian paintings, you have the influence of Palladio over the fireplace there, You have English furniture. You probably have, I would guess you might have English porcelain. It could be French. Let's go into the next slide and look at this little vignette here of that very same room. So you've got paintings of Venice, then you have a late 18th century English table, and then beneath that, you have George I giltwood ewers. There's nothing to me that's more luscious than all this coming together. And though you can see configurations like this in other houses in Europe, nothing quite sets it off like it does in an English country house. I think one of the most amazing things the Castle of Harewood has in its collection is this Delft flower pagoda that was made, amazingly enough, in 1695. It's just under 5 feet tall. And there's probably nothing else like it in the world. And it has probably been at Castle Harewood since it was made. And when you stand in front of this, its size just sort of overwhelms you. And it's so exotic, and I might even say erotic, if you look at the sphinxes with their very prominent nipples and the faces beneath them. It's this interesting combination of Baroque and Oriental influences all coming together, and just a perfect evocation of what Europeans thought of as exotic cultures in the late 17th and early 18th centuries. So now we're up to the H's. We're going to go to Harewood House, which is, I have to say, very subjectively, in my opinion, one of the finest English country houses ever built. I think a lot of people would agree with me when I say that, but for me, I say that because it's so neoclassical. This great house was built by John Carr of York, a local architect, and it was altered later in the 18th and 19th centuries. It's still owned by the family that built it, the Earls of Harewood. And if we go inside, we can see the cinnamon drawing room. Robert Adam is the man who did up almost all the interiors in this house. And for those of you who know me, you know that Robert Adam is sort of the beat of my heart, even though he wasn't a very nice human being. But he had amazing taste. And what he did better, I think, than anybody was plasterwork. I mean, he, of course, didn't do it, but he designed it, and he had Joseph Rose plasterers that worked for him around the country. And you can see here in the drawing room ceiling, the cinnamon drawing room ceiling, how fantastic what he could do and the diversity of what he could do. So this is neoclassical with other little elements thrown into it. But if you go into the gallery, which I think is by far the most impressive room in the house, and for my money, one of the most impressive rooms in the world, full stop, you can see this is much more neoclassical. And this room is just spectacular because what you have is a room that's 76 feet long, it's 24 feet wide, 21 feet high, and it's hung with a collection of Renaissance paintings and furniture by Chippendale the Younger. It's a tour de force of unimaginable lusciousness. I took a tour here more than once, actually, and I've said to them before we walked into this room, I said, now everyone prepare yourself. This is better than the Hall of Mirrors at Versailles. And that's not an exaggeration for me. I think it's absolutely true. Now look at the detail of this plasterwork in the ceiling. God, this just makes me swoon. It's so gorgeous. I actually took this photograph and turned it into a card on moo.com. And it gives me so much pleasure to me about things like this because everything that Adam did is just perfect here. Little light colors, pastels. He's referencing excavations that are going on, Herculaneum in Pompeii, the new discoveries, and it all comes together in this harmonious whole. I should also mention that we estimate in today's dollars, it costs about $80 million to build this house. So you weren't poor if you did this, and you certainly weren't poor if you commissioned Chippendale, who grew up actually not very far from here, to do the furniture. This is the most important set of furniture made by Chippendale in the world. And his state bed, which you see here, which is, I have to admit, just a little bit over the top, is pretty amazing. If you look at the inside, they very kindly let me go up and take a photograph inside the dome, what you're meant to see if you're looking up. I'm sure that was meant to inspire you to have great children. To me, what's more impressive actually than the bed, getting back to the plasterwork again, is the plasterwork. Now look at this ceiling that Adam did for this room, bringing in all the colors that move back and forth with the bed hangings, and that bed, of course, has been restored in the last 20 years, so it didn't always look that nice, but the same greens, the same luscious colors coming together. If you want to go on a tour de force of Chippendale, the kinds of things people come here to see, literally from all over the world to study Chippendale, is this. the sideboard and the wine cooler that he designed for the state dining room. And that wine cooler, sometimes called a cellaret, is one of the richest pieces of furniture I think ever made, and one of the most beautiful. If we go to the yellow drawing room, once again, Adam at his most yummy. You look at that incredible glass over the fireplace there, the mirror to the left, but the real reason we're here is because of the ceiling. Now look at these colors in this ceiling. These lilacs and yellows, and the yellows coming into the wall. And in anticipation of this lecture, I went into the Harewood House website and I bought this scarf that mimics the yellow drawing room ceiling. You can see it right here in the next slide. And the colors are slightly different because I think they wanted to make it work more for a scarf, but gosh, this is gorgeous. I just couldn't resist. I mean, it's just like, damn, I want a piece of hardwood with me wherever I go. Now, I have to go out briefly into the gardens of Harewood House and show you one of the sculptures. This is Orpheus that was done in 1984 for the 7th Earl of Harewood, the late Earl. Now, this is interesting because if those of you are familiar with the great Jacob Epstein sculpture of Adam that the same Earl purchased for the entry hall, and you are familiar with this Orpheus, you do see a certain genetic physical similarity in the two statues, and that's all I'm going to say. So, Newby Hall, we're up to the ends. This is a very interesting house because right in front of you there, that middle block, the taller part, is probably designed by Christopher Wren. We don't actually know, but it's attributed to him. And that's nice. To me, what makes this house more important are the bits designed by Robert Adam, and that's the bit to the right, the lower part. He designed these additions, and he also did a lot of the interiors over. This has gotten multiple awards for its gardens. As a matter of fact, it's gotten the best garden in England award a number of times. And in this next slide, you can see the house almost fading into the distance, once again, a result of too much sun. But this amazing herbaceous border on both sides that goes down this great avenue, and this is not even the end of it. And this great avenue has sort of perpendicular avenues that come off of it into little garden rooms. And you can see in this next slide a perfect example of one of those. This to me is just magic because you're walking off a very grand space and you instantly come into this little coziness, a little bit of loveliness that takes you away from the world. And you can see the same thing here in the next slide again. These rooms aren't meant to be terribly impressive. They're meant to be sort of food for the soul. And to me, they accomplish that. Going inside, we come into Robert Adams' entrance hall. This is actually a photograph from the 2012 tour that I took here. But this is not a huge room, but look around at the plasterwork. Everything in this room is military focused. So if we go into one of the panels on the wall, you can see this is very martial. This is an idea, once again, it's military, but it's very Roman. Look at all that plasterwork. Everything about it there is saying ancient Rome, because by this time, by the 18th century, Britain saw itself as the new Rome, as the new world empire, and there was everything you could possibly do to emulate Rome. I think the ceiling here is a tour de force as well. The same colors, and it shows you actually you don't have to have lots of colors to make a big impact. Those of you who know me really well know that one of my passions is this semi-precious stone called Blue John, a variety of fluorspar that is only found in one place in the world, and that's in Derbyshire, England. And this is a casket that is in the entrance hall at Newby made of Blue John. I've never seen this particular shape before in Blue John. And this is a great example of the colors. We think that the Blue John word comes from a corruption of the French bleu jaune, meaning blue yellow. And there are certainly blues and yellows, but there are also purples and browns and whites. It's just an amazing stone. It's almost been exhausted. So these pieces are becoming incredibly valuable. I think probably the biggest reason to come to this house architecturally is the sculpture gallery, which is one of Robert Adams' masterpieces. Original colors, you go further in and you look up into this dome, which is modeled on the Villa Maremma in Rome, and of course the Pantheon. And It's small, it's not as big as the Pantheon in Rome, but it has such a presence to it. And the colors are amazing. And it was built to accommodate what was then one of the most important collections in the world of ancient sculpture. And the most important piece in that room was the Jenkins Venus, which was a 1st to 2nd century AD Roman sculpture. Now, what you see here before you is a 21st century copy. That's because in 2002, the original was sold for about $12 million because they needed to fix the stable block. And this is another example of what I was talking to you about before of how it's important to realize what it takes to run one of these houses. And something that's very unglamorous, which is repairing the stables, and selling something beautiful like this, that's a sad trade-off. But part of the condition of the sale was whoever bought it had to pay for an exact copy of the same kind of marble, Carrara marble, and they did photography of the original, and then they had lasers that cut that marble. This is such a good copy, I defy anybody except the best experts to tell the difference. It shows you, to me, I'd rather have this because it doesn't have to be insured, and I've got the $12 million in my stables by now. But there are little tribunes, little side sections that go off of this great Pantheon dome that have things like this in it. This is a wonderful Roman sarcophagus, and everything you see around you is primarily ancient Roman. And the ceiling in this part is slightly different than what we saw in the Pantheon. Once again, the same color schemes, and I think it shows you the beauty of Adam. If you look in the background there, toward the bottom, you can see sphinxes. And sphinxes and griffins were two things that Robert Adam, thank you very much, Ginevra, used over and over again. They became sort of emblems of neoclassicism, and no one made better use of them than Adam. We're still in the ends, and we're going to go to Nostell Priory. I should also say that Newby is still owned by the family, descended down from the original family, and is privately run and beautifully kept. Nostell Priory, which you see before you now, is owned by the National Trust and has been since 1953. So you can probably tell that this house was never finished because there was supposed to be a balancing wing on the left that never happened. And the rumor is that the man who built it, Sir Roland, was it Sir Roland? Let me think who it was. It was Sir Roland Wren. He was using his wife's money, and she was really taken aghast at how much he was spending on this house. So when he died and that wing wasn't finished, she said, "We're done." The reason the word priory exists here is that there were originally 12th century monastic buildings here. And this house is very, very much influenced by Palladio. It was designed by James Paine, and the interiors were by both Paine and Robert Adam. Robert Adam sort of superseded Paine as a more stylish architect as the 18th century went along. So we're going to go to the entrance hall, what they oftentimes call the upper hall. And this is, you can guess, Robert Adam by the plasterwork, the delicacy of the plasterwork. And I have a lovely close-up of this, which shows you everything that I think made Adam Adam. I mean, just the swirls. And this is not, I don't want to give him too much credit because even though he was, I think, a genius, you can find almost all these precedents in the grottos of ancient Rome or in Pompeii and Herculaneum. But still, he interpreted them in a way that made them very appropriate for the 18th century. Now you can contrast that with the rooms that Paine did. This is the breakfast room, which is lovely. It's no longer a breakfast room. It's turned into a sitting room in the 19th century, but very traditional for its time period. And the same thing can be said for the Crimson Room, which is a bedroom also designed by Paine, very much in what you would expect to be a comfortable Georgian house of a family of importance. I should also say that this is one of the most important collections of Chippendale as well, not as important as Harewood's, but because Chippendale actually grew up almost on this estate, he did over 90, maybe 100 pieces for this house, all of which are still here today. To me, the tour de force is actually the dining room, which was James Paine again. And you'll begin to see what I mean about Paine versus Robert Adam. So this has got much more Baroque, that's a combination of Baroque and Rococo. That's what I was trying to say. And that's what Payne is doing here. This is not pure neoclassicism. Even though there are neoclassical elements in this, you would be hard-pressed to find Robert Adam doing a room like this. But there are amazing things in this room, and I don't mean to say but, it's an amazing room, period, no buts. Let's look at this wonderful torchère. Yes, Ginevra's very kindly pointing to them. I don't know what these are. I think they're 19th century. They probably were oil originally, and you can see that cord hanging down. My guessing is that they were electrified probably in the 20th century, but they're just so perfect for this room. And something else that's perfect for this room is this serving table, which was designed by the architect James Payne specifically for this room. Painted furniture is not that common in England, and this is, I think, a particularly rich piece. And you can see that goat, which goats are oftentimes meant to be a sign of drunkenness and libidinous, and the same thing with those grapes. That means signs of Bacchus, which means you're going to drink in this room, lots of wine. I think this all fits together just perfectly. We were very lucky to get a tour here before the house opened to the public with the National Trust curator, and we ended it in the staircase hall, which I think is almost unique on an English house because it's meant to evoke the interior of a great galleon. If you look up from 18th century galleons, you have that same sort of like rectangular squared off windows. And this was designed by James Payne as well. And you can sort of see, once again, Baroque and Rococo pieces coming in, but an amazing house. So now we're going to go to the S's. And this may be the most welcoming house that we went to in the tour. This is Sion Hill Hall, that is a little known house. It's not open to the public very often. It's also the newest house we went to. It was built in 1913. It was probably the last great country house built in England before World War I. World War I is hugely important in the story of the English country house because the war was the beginning of the end for these houses, and servants didn't come back. Taxes, money, it just was a disaster for these houses. But this house survives on all kinds of luscious levels, not the least of which because it's not too big. And it was designed by an architect who was called the Lutyens of the North. Lutyens was one of the most important British architects of the 20th century. And this man's name was Walter Brierly, and he designed houses that were easy to live in. And this is the man who lives there now, Michael Malaby, who very kindly opened it up and gave us a tour of these gardens, which you see here in the middle and the right, which he has lusciously restored. And then the inside, which he has filled with amazing treasures, but look at the scale. So this ground floor hallway, which actually goes in even further where I'm standing for this photograph, gives you a sense of the house. It's big, but look at the height of the ceilings. And you can particularly see that if we go into the study. Every room has these very civilized ceilings. They're not overly tall, and every room is just bursting with incredible pieces of well-picked treasures. I mean, Michael is an amazing and erudite host, and he welcomed us with champagne, and we had sandwiches. It was the most brilliant day. Oh my goodness, it just sort of went on and into the dining room, and then into the sitting room. It just, look at this. Everything you see here, I think, really is of the perfect taste. And the key thing is that it's manageable. It's not a huge estate. It's still an estate. It's not over the top. And these are the houses that tended to survive. And I say survive because after the war, the Second World War, there were hundreds, if not thousands, over 1,000 houses that were lost because people couldn't afford to live in them, primarily because they're just too big. And houses like this size were the ones that survived because you could still see yourself living in them. When we were upstairs in the bedrooms, one of the participants in the tour pointed this out to me, and that's her hand there. She said, take a picture of this. And she and I both thought it was so cool. This is something that was in your room if you were a guest, telling you exactly what the important things of the day were, including what time the mail left. I mentioned that this is still a country estate, and I think this photograph of the local hunt in front of the house shows you very much how these traditional estates continue to work today and how they really bring a sense of gravitas. And in this really horrible world we're living in right now, things like this just give you a sense of solidity that things are going to be all right. We're up to the S's, and we're up to one of my favorite houses in the world, actually, Sledmere House. Not very impressive looking from the outside, and that's probably by design because the inside knocks your socks off. But before we get to the inside, I want to say a few things about the outside. Probably designed by the man who built it, Sir Christopher Sykes, and it's still owned by his descendant today, Sir Tatton Sykes, and it's remained in the family since it was built. 2,000-acre park, so that's the land all around the house. It has astonishing interiors, but very sadly, all this was burned in 1911. There was a fire that was so serious that the only thing that was left standing were the 4 outer walls. But it was, interestingly, a very slow burning fire. So almost all the contents were rescued, including, and I love this, the doors and the banisters. It took 18 hours to burn. It's a long time to burn. And more amazing is that the original drawings for the plasterwork of the house and the 19th century watercolors that showed each room's interior were saved. So everything was able to be rebuilt. And starting in 1912 and going up to about 1917, the house was rebuilt exactly as it was in the 18th century. And when you come into the hall, which you'll see the fireplace here, this to me is an astonishing work of plaster, especially considering it was done in the 20th century. And I think the colors are perfect as well. This next slide, you'll see a little more detail of that same plasterwork. And you see the one on the right has very much a Wedgwood Jasperware thing going on. This house is so immaculately maintained. It's hard to describe how everything is just almost perfect and pristine. It has, believe it or not, you wouldn't think so from the outside, it has a dome. And when you go up the staircase, which has this amazing dome looking up, once again, too much sun. I couldn't look directly into the dome itself, but you see that lovely copy of the Apollo Belvedere there. It just sort of knocks your socks off. Well, knocking your socks off can go a little bit further because we were hosted for lunch in the dining room. And of course, need I say this house was open just for us. There was nobody else there but us. We wouldn't have it any other way. These lunches and these dinners are the real coming together in these tours. It's where we bond with each other, with the owners. It's relaxed. Good food and good alcohol are very conducive to good conversation. Beyond that, there's beauty. And if you look at this next slide, you can see beyond the very end there of the dining room what Sir Tatton, the current owner, has done. The lovely columns he's had painted to look like lapis with those gilded capitals and the blue and white behind it. It's too yummy for words. But I have to say what goes even bigger than that is the ceiling of the drawing room. Look at this. You just have to take a big sigh. I mean, everything is perfect about this room. The ceiling, the chandelier, the everything. But the reason you come here, the biggest reason to come here is because of the library. This runs the entire width of the house, and it is pretty astonishing. Very sadly, it had an important collection of books in it. I say had, because they're gone now, including a Gutenberg Bible from 1450. That Bible and 2,600 other books were sold in 1824 so that the then owner, Sir Tatton Sykes, the 4th Baronet, could fund his favorite pack of hounds. Now, this has never been a poor family, but it shows you where his priorities were, and that's okay. It's his house. There are still books there today, but I want to give you a sense of where this house comes from architecturally. So keep this in your mind and then look at this 19th century engraving of the Baths of Caracalla in Rome on which it was modeled. And there are remnants of these baths that still exist today in Rome. The most modern reproduction of this that shows you the real scale and monumentality of it was in Pennsylvania Station in New York, and you see a photograph of that here. Very sadly, Penn Station was demolished in the 1960s, one of the greatest architectural travesties of the 20th century in America. Just look at the scale of that. This is just the entry hall walking into the train station. The closest we have that survives today of the hall from the Baths of Caracalla is here in Boston at the Boston Public Library, Bates Hall, which has similar proportions. It's a little bigger than the library at Sledmere. It's a little smaller than the actual Baths of Caracalla themselves, but still like, wow. And the most surprising room here is the Turkish room, which is filled with tiles from Damascus. And that was created in the early 20th century specifically to honor a man who was important in Anglo-Middle East relations. And in that case, this is Sir Mark Sykes, who was very important during World War I in trying to negotiate what would happen to this part of the world after the war ended. Sadly, his life ended in 1919 at the age of 39, ironically enough, considering we're going through a pandemic now, from the 1918 pandemic. And this was made in his honor, and this is a copy of this room of one of the Sultan's apartments in one of his palaces in Istanbul. So the last thing we're going to see at Sledmere is the chapel. This is a 20th century creation. It has a lot of interesting stuff going on. It's a Roman Catholic chapel. The ceiling that you see here is painted by Thomas Errington and has depictions of the four winged creatures of the evangelists. And it's very 20th century, late 20th century, but it works. And it's interesting. I've never seen a chandelier like that in a chapel before, but it works for me. So we're up to the T's now. This is Temple Newsome House. As you can see, built between 1500 and 1520. There's a lot going on here because there's been a building here, probably a house, for almost 1,000 years. We know that the word Newsome comes from the Anglo-Saxon for new place. And we also know that in the Middle Ages, the Knights Templar owned this piece of land. So it's very likely that's where Temple Newsome came from. The current house was built by a man who was a courtier at the court of Henry VII and Henry VIII. And interestingly enough, one of the most, I think, infamous people grew up here, and that is, if you can think back to your history, Lord Darnley, who was the second husband of Mary Queen of Scots and who was the father of James VI and James I. And not a very nice guy. But you see what that arrow is right there? In the 17th century, the house was done over. And where that arrow is, when we go to the next slide, you can see a little bit better. There's a balustrade that runs around the entire house that has a saying in it. And I'm going to read it to you. It says in English, "All glory and praise be given to God the Father, the Son, and the Holy Ghost on high. Peace on earth, goodwill towards men, honor and true allegiance to our gracious King, loving affection amongst his subjects, health and plenty be within this house." You had to have a big house to fit all those letters in. This house is now owned by the city of Leeds, and it was actually, interestingly enough, it was sold by the last private owner to the city in the early 20th century, primarily for use as a park, as a public park, which it is today. And they offered the contents of the house to the city, and for £10,000, the house and the grounds were sold for £25,000, and they turned them down. So one of the most important treasure houses in the north of England was auctioned off. But there's a happy ending to this story, because so many good things start in Boston. And in this case, there was a curator from the Museum of Fine Arts in Boston whose name was Philip Hendy. And in the 1940s, he was hired to be the curator here. And he said, you know what? This is a good time to be buying things from country houses. This is the time right after the war, particularly when people were just not staying in these houses. So they were selling the contents in the houses, and he started buying up the bits and pieces, and he started furnishing Temple Newsome with these pieces, which is why it is today called the V&A, the Victoria and Albert of the North. It is an incredible treasure-filled house, and it has two purposes. It shows period rooms from when it was a house, and then has objects from other houses that have been brought there. So let's look first at the Chinese drawing room, which you see here, which is one of the period rooms from when it was a house. This is a late 18th, early 19th century house when chinoiserie was very popular in England and actually all throughout Europe. And then we can go into the library, which has very Baroque plasterwork from the 18th century in it. Now, of course, this is all within the shell of a 16th century house. And this is very much the story of these houses in general, which is to say you have a house, a starting period, and things that have been added to over and over, subtracted, demolished. And then one of the few things we have from the original house here is the staircase, which is very Tudor. And of course, that is the core of the house. I think the greatest room in the house is the long gallery, which is 18th century and has some of the finest pieces of art in it. Once again, this is what we saw earlier. This is the kind of house that you would use to exercise in and to show off your best pieces of art and collections. And here in this next slide, we see one of those pieces. This is actually a table from another house we're going to see in just a few minutes called Wentworth Woodhouse. And this is a perfect example of what Philip Hendy was doing when people were selling these things from these houses in the mid-20th century, pretty much on the cheap. He was buying them up and creating what some people have now called the Hampton Palace of the North. One of the most spectacular acquisitions is this silver cistern that was made for another house in Yorkshire, Wentworth Castle, for Lord Raby. This is solid silver, and it was meant to contain ice to keep your wine cold. And it's pretty spectacular when you walk into the entrance hall, which is where it is. And something else that's in the entrance hall is this amazing console table from a house in Oxfordshire called Ditchley Park, which still survives. As a matter of fact, all these three houses I just mentioned all survive. It shows you that just because contents were sold doesn't mean a house was necessarily torn down. And then something like this, when we went there in 2012, and this is from the 2012 tour, they had just purchased this amazing piece of silver. This is a chinoiserie silver centerpiece that was made to show off how rich you were. Two things showing you how rich you are. One, that you could afford silver like this in the latest style. But two, because you have these exotic fruits, things that we take for granted today that would have been very hard to obtain in 18th century England unless you had your own greenhouses or your hothouses or you imported them. In any case, it showed that you were rich. And this is an astonishing creation. I've never seen anything quite like it before. We're very lucky to go through here as well before it opened to the public, and we had the furniture conservator take apart this amazing 18th century secretaire for us. I mean, he just sort of kept going. More and more boxes got pulled out. And of course, it's interesting to mention the derivation of the word secretaire. It's nothing to do with the secretary or sitting at a desk. It comes from the word secret, because that's what these were. These were pieces of furniture that had lots and lots of secret compartments in them. So now we're going to go to the city of York itself, to Treasurer's House, which, like so many things that we've seen, is of all kinds of different periods, but primarily from the 17th century. The core of this house, believe it or not, was built in the 11th century, and this was the home for the treasurer of York Minster. So York Minster is literally across the street, and it is, of course, one of the greatest medieval cathedrals in Europe. The Reformation ended that. You didn't need a treasury anymore, and the house was sold into private ownership. By 1711, it had been turned into tenements. And then in the late 19th century, in the 1890s, a local man called Frank Green bought it. He was a self-made industrialist, and he bought out each of the various owners and restored all the bits and pieces, brought it all back. In the course of restoration, they discovered in his basement the remains of Roman columns. Very interesting, but not surprising, because York was founded by the Romans in the 1st century, and we know that where this house was built is directly over a road that the Romans built that led out of York into the north. So 1930, Frank gives the house to the National Trust, and who own it today. 1953, the National Trust have hired a plumber by the name of Harry Martindale to work on the pipes. He's working downstairs in the cellar when he became aware of music that sounded like the blare of trumpets. That's a little weird. After the music stopped, a Roman soldier wearing a plumed helmet emerged from the wall, followed by a cart horse and 10 pairs of green tunic-clad armed legionnaires marching in formation. Well, he basically ran from the house screaming and really never wanted to go back there again. He was interviewed by local historians. He described everything that he saw. They had artists draw it. the uniforms, he had lots of details in his mind. And the historians dismissed him as a crank because they said, we know from evidence that Roman soldiers never wore uniforms like this. Well, let's fast forward through the end of the 20th century, and new excavations in New York come across proof that the soldiers that he described actually did exist in those uniforms. It was when the Roman Empire was crumbling in the 5th century and the regular garrison was pulled out of York, and they had an auxiliary garrison come in, and they wore these tunics that he described that heretofore had been unknown. Now, how is that for a cool ghost story? So Frank Green, I mentioned before, saved this house, and he brought all the various elements together. So when you walk into what is today the Great Hall, this is part of the exterior wall of a Tudor house, incorporating even earlier elements. The upstairs drawing room is 17th and 18th century, and what Frank Green was a magpie. He bought all this furniture. Sometimes he bought entire rooms and reconstructed them. So the paneling here would have come from another house. And if you go into Princess Victoria's bedroom, which he completely created, named, by the way, not for Queen Victoria when she was a princess, but actually for the king at the time, Edward VII's daughter, who was also named Victoria. This bed that he supplied for this room came, we believe, from Houghton Hall in Norfolk. And this is a George II bed that is, actually, when we went here, our CEO, Brinton Simons, who loves this particular color green, I could not pull him away from this bed. It's a lovely little bed. And in the same room, you can also see the chimney piece. And this is what Frank did. This came from another house, a townhouse in York called Micklegate. He bought this and stuck it in here. Now, to possibly the most amazing house in England. I mentioned earlier we had furniture that had come to Temple Newsam from Wentworth Woodhouse. That's what you see here. It's been called by architecture historians one of the wonders of English architecture. It has a facade that is 606 feet long. It's the longest facade of any private house in Europe. It's twice as long, for instance, as Buckingham Palace. It has 365 rooms, 1,000 windows, and 5 miles of underground passages. My favorite story about this is in the 19th century, when you came to stay here as a house guest, it was so confusing that every house guest was given a little silver canister with a colored confetti inside, and every canister had a different color confetti, and you were told what your color was, and you sprinkled a path from your bedroom so you knew how to get back that night. And not surprisingly, if you look at the grandeur of this, this is supposedly the inspiration for Pemberley in Pride and Prejudice, Mr. Darcy's house. Let's take a little closer look at this facade. This facade has nothing else quite like it. These people were super rich. They created a house that is really just breathtaking is the only word I can actually come up with for it. If we go into the greatest room in the house, which is the Great Hall, you can see what a lot of people called at the time it was built in the 1760s, the most beautiful room in England. 60 feet, it's a 60-foot square and has a ceiling that's 40 feet. But to me, one of the most amazing things about this is the floor. When this was a school, which it was, the family left here in the 1940s, and it was a school up until the 1980s or 90s. This was covered up with plywood, and it was a polytechnic school. Look at that incredible stonework and those wonderful yellow scagliola columns behind. It just goes on and on. But lest you think it's entirely classical, I'll take you into the Whistle Jacket room, which is named after the famous horse painting by Stubbs. This is a copy. It's here today. The original is in the National Gallery in London. So look at this incredible carving. So it's on the walls. So look at the plasterwork on the ceilings of this house. This is a very Baroque room, very much different from what you would see in the rest of the house. And I think this particular shot shows you the richness of the family, and they were so rich they had one room that was nothing but Van Dyck's, and we were very lucky when we went here. Once again, they opened this just for us, and we had lunch in the Van Dyck room, and this is actually the fireplace from the Van Dyck room. And this to me is a perfect example of a typical English 18th century marble fireplace. It's got exquisite carving. You can see in this close-up here, this is a copy probably of an ancient Roman urn that was found. Look at that carving. This would have been done very likely in England itself. This house very sadly has a very sad story attached to it. They tunneled underneath of it for coal mines. It is sinking as we speak. It is sinking. The after it ceased being a school, it was bought by a number of private owners. None of them had the money to properly fix it up, and in 2017, it was taken over by a trust that are trying to stop it from falling apart. And they need to raise, in the next 10 years, $70 million just to keep it from sinking. I have some cool photographs showing you doors that are so off because of the sinking of the house. And the treasures that were here were astonishing. They've all been sold off over the years. There's nothing left of the interiors. But we do have this wonderful shot of our happy little group on the stairs of Wentworth Woodhouse in this lovely summer day in June of 2018. And this also shows you what I think is important for a good tour, which is not having too many people. I never want to have more than 20 people in one of my tours because I want people to sort of bond with each other and to feel that they're a part of a family. And I think nothing shows that sense of family better than the celebrations we do during our last night dinners. This was me with our chairman of the board, Nancy Malsby. Last night we had at the hotel at Middlethorpe Hall. It was just fantastic. Something to me that actually will be more fantastic is that Dr. Ridgway, the curator at Castle Howard, he's going to be giving a lecture for us on December 11th on Christmas at Castle Howard. And the best thing is, if you miss it, because you can sign up for it now and it's free, if you miss it, it will be available for 12 months on YouTube. So you can sign up now and then you can watch it on Christmas Day. You want to be really taken away to a magical world of wonderfulness. And in order for that magical wonderfulness to happen, you have to have a cat or a dog. And this, of course, as I end all my lectures, is my cat, Miles, who has been really pissed off. I'm not paying attention to him. He's been scratching my legs all throughout this lecture. He is winking and wearing his Christmas bow right here. And that's my perfect way of saying to all of you, happy holidays, and thank you so much for joining me tonight.
All right. Well, thank you, Curt, for your fantastic presentation. Before we get to everyone's questions, I'm excited to announce several upcoming art and architecture programs. Curt just mentioned that we'll be joined by Dr. Christopher Ridgway, curator of Castle Howard, on December 11th, and he'll be talking about winter and Christmas at Castle Howard. And then save the date for January 15th, when Curt will return with a presentation on The Crown, a tour of filming locations of the most expensive TV series ever made, which is, of course, based on the very popular Netflix series. I would say that you don't have to have, you don't have to be a fan of the series to really still enjoy some of the interiors and the houses that we're going to take you through on that program. Also in January, we will be holding our very first virtual DiCamillo Rendezvous, bringing together longtime tour participants and viewers of this webinar series for, again, a very special event featuring Curt DiCamillo and historian Carl Raymond. They'll be discussing New York and London in the Gilded Age, and registration for that program is now available. To learn more about all of these programs, visit americanancestors.org/education/online-classes, and I will also include information on these programs in my follow-up email. All right, so let's get to your questions. Go ahead and type your query into the question panel on the right of your screen, and we'll try to answer as many as we can in the time provided. Let's see. So Susan has a fantastic question, and she asks, why are so many of England's finest country houses concentrated in the north?
Well, that's an interesting question. The people in the South would disagree with that. By sheer number, there are more country houses in the South simply because the South was richer. The North, I would guess, the houses you see because they were poorer and because the land was concentrated in fewer owners. So you had enormous estates of hundreds of thousands of acres with one country house at the center of them. So those country houses were particularly grand. And don't forget, particularly in the 16th and 17th centuries, the North was considered savage. Henry VIII was afraid to even go into Yorkshire because it was so lawless. So you had these great magnates at these houses who built these houses who basically ran their own worlds and were their own law. And that's my best guess as to why. A lot of money concentrated in a very few hands, and those hands built great houses.
All right. And I think you mentioned at the start of the program that Yorkshire and Derbyshire had just gorgeous, fantastic houses. Margaret asks, where would you place Shropshire in your in your order of gorgeous houses?
Well, that's a trick question, because those of you who know me know that Shropshire is my favorite place to take a tour, for all kinds of reasons. One of them is Gareth Williams, who is the curator at Weston Park, where we always stay when we go to Shropshire. But it's also because Shropshire is sort of unknown to Americans, certainly. It doesn't get a lot of tourists. The tourists who are there are mainly English. It's the largest inland county in England, and it's sort of a quiet sleeper county. So it has houses that are not necessarily as grand, although there are a number of very grand houses, but they're just they sort of fly under the radar. And they also have a lot of private houses that are not open to the public. And that's something that I particularly like to do on my tours, is to take people in the houses they can't get into on their own. And I should also say, when we talk about the North, it's really Yorkshire. The people in England would be offended if you called Derbyshire the North. It's actually the Midlands. But that's all right. It's north of London. And to a lot of Londoners, that's all that they think of. It's not in the South, so it doesn't really matter.
Now we have a lot of questions about the plaster, and you kept on bringing our attention to the beautiful plaster ceilings and walls. And so Gary asks, are the colors in the plaster tinted while it's wet, or is it painted? And how are the plaster figures added? Do you know?
Well, so the plaster figures are molds, and that's why plasterwork was so wonderful, because before plaster became so popular, you would have to carve things out of wood. And there are still some houses, Wilton House in Wiltshire comes to mind, that have what would normally be plasterwork in carved wood, which was really expensive. And that was the beauty of molds, is that you could put plaster into a mold, wait for it to dry, turn it out, and then you would apply, basically glue that mold onto the ceiling. So it was all white originally. Everything was put up as white. And then it was painted after it dried. And most of the things I showed you today, all of them have the original colors on them. Some of them have been redone. A surprising number of them have not been redone since they were done in the 18th century, which shows you how wonderfully the colors have held up, which is particularly surprising considering how delicate plaster actually really is.
And so kind of going along those lines, I mean, Jennifer asks, are the plaster ceilings repainted, and how often does that need to be done?
Well, as I say, surprisingly few of them have been repainted, and there is no easy question as to how often they need to be done. It's funny. Today, if you did a plaster ceiling today, and actually I know of some contemporary people who've done it in the early 21st century in America, 18th century style plasterwork ceilings, and have them painted. Because they don't use candles or fires or oil lamps, they could probably go 100 years easily and not have to be repainted, because that's what made those ceilings age, was the smoke coming up from candles, and particularly from gas lamps that would darken them. And you can go into a lot of houses when you can see they've been very active and the ceilings have been darkened. But so the answer is, there is no answer. It really just depended on the usage of the house. And of course, the higher the ceiling, the less it was subject to getting really close damage. Although, if you remember back when the Sistine Chapel was being cleaned, and that's a very high ceiling indeed, they revealed huge bright colors that had never been known, because the candle wax because of all the services that had been held in the chapel, had floated up to the ceiling. So that's something else as well, is that until you pick apart your ceiling and have an analysis done of the paint, you may not know exactly what it looks like. So in other words, what we see today, and we know they're the original colors and it's never been repainted, might need to be repainted. We may not think so, because it looks fine to us, and the colors beneath that could be so much more brilliant. But like everything else, it takes money to do that. And if you are a homeowner and you've got fixing the roof in one hand and the plumbing, or getting the plasterwork restored, plasterwork is not going to be high on the list, sadly.
Now, we also have a few questions regarding the source of wealth of the folks who lived in and built and expanded these houses. Where did that money come from? And Karen asks specifically, you know, in the 18th century, where was that wealth coming from?
If you can think back to Gone with the Wind, when Scarlett O'Hara's father said to her, the only thing that matters, Katie Scarlett, is land. And that's where all the money came from. Land. Land that you farmed yourself, land that you leased out to other farmers, land that you owned buildings on. So most of these houses had more than one village that they owned. So everybody in the village paid them rent, whether it's for the shop or for the house. It wasn't really until the mid-18th century that we had the beginnings of a stock market. So that was the beginning of the modern world. But even then, when you had fortunes made in the 18th century in trade or the stock market, they were very much looked down upon by the old families because real money only came from land. And that was something that's actually, strangely enough, carried forward even until today. So that's the nature of a country house. I mean, that's important to remember. A country house is not a house in the country. Country house is a house that is or was the center of a great agricultural estate. All the land around it supported it.
All right, and also a number of people are asking about our next heritage tours and if we have any planned for 2021 and kind of what the status is of our plans to travel. Do you want to take this?
Sure. We still have on the books a plan in June of Country Houses of Norfolk, which we hope will go forward. We simply don't know yet. We have to wait and see how COVID plays out. In October, we're going to see great villas and gardens of Rome, and that is important for all kinds of reasons, not the least of them being that so many of these great houses are based on Roman precedent. Matter of fact, what you're looking at right now where it says questions, this is a house in Derbyshire called Kettleston Hall, and that's based on an ancient Roman atrium. So Rome is the beginning for all these great houses, certainly the classical ones. And then in December of next year, we have a tour that I feel very confident, in fact, will go forward, which is an English country Christmas, which will be the first week of December. We will be in Shropshire at Weston Park, and we'll be seeing historic houses. We'll be dotting it in as well with visits from carolers, going to Christmas fairs, going to where Christmas Carol was filmed for Scrooge's parties, all kinds of fun stuff, sleigh rides. It just makes me feel all giddy just thinking about it.
And I will include a link to our Heritage Tours website in my follow-up email to you. Soon you'll be able to at least submit your name under interest lists for each of the tours. And then that way we can notify you if we move forward with the tour, if anything changes, or if the itineraries are available. So that's another way to stay kind of up to date with the programs and the tours that we have planned in the coming year and beyond. Let's see, one final question, and this is from Christopher, actually our speaker for next month. Chris asks, have you taken a tour to the east of Yorkshire to the Burtons, Burton Agnes, Burton Constable?
Not only have I not taken a tour there, I've never been there myself, Chris. So next time I come, that's what you're gonna have to take me to. These are very important houses that Chris is talking about, and I have not been to any of them. You know what I would like to see? I know Burton Constable is more important. I want to see Constable Burt, which of course is the 18th century version. And this is just another example of the houses that Yorkshire has. Really astonishing houses. And Chris is very kindly selling his home county, as he should.
Well, good. And that's kind of a nice transition into the next month and the next time that we'll see all of you, hopefully back here for our next session in this webinar series. So thank you again, Curt. Thank you everyone for joining us today. As you leave the event, you will have the opportunity to fill out a survey and give us your feedback as we continue to expand our webinars and online offerings. Any and all feedback is extremely helpful and appreciated. This free webinar was made possible by the generous support of members and friends around the world. Please consider making a gift to American Ancestors to keep these programs free and to create more free programs and other programs for you and other audiences around the world. If you'd like to learn more about American Ancestors and the fabulous heritage tours, many of which are led by Curt, and we've just given you a preview to some of them, please visit americanancestors.org/heritage-tours. Stay safe, stay healthy, and I hope to see you at our online programs in the future. Goodbye for now.